She had nothing left, but the cowboy still opened his ranch to the freezing Apache girl. The wind howled across the snow-covered desert, carrying a cold so sharp it cut through the thickest layers of clothing. The sun had already dipped behind the jagged mesas, leaving a gray light that made the frozen landscape look even more desolate. Among the silent stretches of white and brown, a small figure stumbled across the uneven ground. She was barely more than a girl, her clothes torn and soaked, and she clutched a tiny bundle close to her chest, as if it contained everything she had left in the world. Her eyes, wide and frightened, searched desperately for shelter. Her name was Ayanna, and she had nowhere else to go. The girl had been traveling for days through the bitter cold, pushed forward by a mix of fear and hope. Her family had been forced from their home, leaving nothing but memories and loss behind. She did not understand why the world had turned against her people, or why kindness had become so rare. Hunger gnawed at her belly, and her hands were numb, yet she pressed on. Every step was agony, but the thought of giving up never crossed her mind. Of a matter of pride, even if it meant facing the cold alone. Ayanna finally noticed the fence of a small ranch in the distance. The structure was modest, made of weathered wood and patched in places, but it promised warmth and safety. Her pace quickened, dragging her numb body toward the hope of shelter. When she reached the gate, she almost collapsed, her legs trembling and her vision blurred. She leaned heavily against the wood, letting herself catch her breath, and listened. The wind moaned through the gaps in the fence, but she could hear something else, a low, steady creaking, like someone moving inside. From the porch, a man appeared. His figure was strong, his posture wary. He was in his 40s, dressed in simple clothing, boots dusted with snow, and a hat pulled low over his eyes. His face was weathered by sun and wind, showing years of hard work and quiet suffering. He noticed the girl instantly, and for a moment he hesitated. He had seen many travelers pass by, and most of them carried nothing but trouble or grief. But something about her made him pause. There was fear in her eyes, yes, but also a small spark of determination. She had survived this far, and that alone told him she was more than she seemed. The girl tried to speak, but only a shiver escaped her lips. Her teeth chattered uncontrollably, and the small bundle she carried slipped from her arms, landing in the snow. The man moved quickly, stepping off the porch and crossing the frozen ground. He knelt beside her, scooping up the bundle and wrapping it around his hand to keep it from freezing. "Hey," he said gently, his voice low but firm. "It's all right. Come inside." Ayanna looked up at him, confusion and suspicion warring on her face. She had been told all her life to be wary of strangers, that the world could be cruel and unforgiving, yet something in his eyes reassured her. She nodded slightly, unable to speak, and let him guide her through the gate. The snow crunched under their feet, each step a reminder of the bitter cold that clung to her body. Inside the small house, the warmth hit her like a wave. The fire in the hearth crackled, casting a soft golden glow on the wooden walls. The man, whose name was Silas, led her to a chair near the fire and offered her a blanket. She shivered as she wrapped it around herself, feeling the warmth slowly seep into her frozen limbs. He went to fetch some water, and when he returned, he offered it to her. She drank slowly, each sip giving her strength she did not realize she had lost. Silas watched her carefully, noting the exhaustion etched on her face, the bruises on her arms, and the dirt that clung to her clothes. He did not ask her where she had come from, not yet. That would come in time. For now, he only focused on keeping her alive. As she warmed by the fire, Ayanna's eyes wandered around the room. It was simple but clean, with a few pieces of furniture, shelves lined with jars, and a table with a small pile of supplies. She realized how long it had been since she had seen a place like this, safe, steady, and free from the fear of sudden attacks. A tear slipped down her cheek, unnoticed by Silas as he worked to prepare some food. He placed a small bowl of stew before her, and she ate carefully, savoring each bite as if it were a treasure. Silas had lived alone on the ranch for years. He was used to solitude and had grown accustomed to the harshness of the desert and the unforgiving winters. But there was something about the girl that stirred a part of him he thought had long been buried. Her presence reminded him of the family he had lost long ago, of promises he could not keep, and of a gentleness he had forgotten he was capable of. Yet he kept his emotions in check, letting his actions speak. He offered her warmth, food, and shelter without question. The night stretched on, and outside the wind continued to rage. Ayanna finally began to relax, though she remained quiet. She did not know if she could trust him completely, but she felt a small flicker of hope that perhaps she had found safety for the first time in days. Silas tended the fire, keeping it alive, and watched her carefully. Every so often she would glance at him, and in those brief moments their eyes met, an unspoken understanding passed between them. She was alone, yes, but not abandoned anymore. Sleep finally came to Ayanna, curled in the blanket near the fire, though it was light and filled with dreams of both fear and hope. Silas stayed awake, listening to the wind, keeping the fire alive and thinking about the road that had brought her to his doorstep. He knew the desert was harsh, that danger often lurked in unexpected corners, but he also knew he could not turn her away. She had nothing left, and he had enough to share. The thought was simple, but in a world that often seemed cruel, it was enough. Morning arrived slowly, bringing a pale sun that struggled to rise above the mountains. The light revealed the snow-covered ranch sparkling under the weak winter sun. Ayanna awoke to the smell of fresh bread and the warmth of the fire. Silas had prepared breakfast, a small but nourishing meal, and he encouraged her to eat. She did, and slowly strength returned to her limbs. As she ate, Silas began to speak gently. He asked her name, and she whispered, "Ayanna." He nodded, as if the name itself carried weight, and told her she was safe here. He did not ask too many questions yet, for he knew that trust could not be forced. Instead, he focused on small acts, showing her where to wash, how to warm her clothes, and how to care for her feet, which had been nearly frozen in the snow. The day passed slowly, and Ayanna began to explore the small corners of the ranch under Silas's watchful eye. She touched the animals cautiously, learning that they were friendly, and marveled at the small garden that managed to survive the harsh winter. Silas taught her simple tasks, and she listened carefully, absorbing every detail. For the first time in many days, she felt a sense of purpose, a reason to keep moving forward. Evening came again, bringing the cold with it. Ayanna and Silas sat near the fire, and for a moment, silence settled between them. It was a comfortable silence, the kind that spoke of safety and understanding. She began to tell him small pieces of her story, though carefully, afraid of revealing too much. Silas listened without interruption, never judging, only acknowledging her pain with quiet nods and gentle words. In that moment, the ranch became more than just a place of survival. It became a place of trust, a fragile sanctuary in a world that had offered her so little. Night fell again, and as Ayanna drifted into sleep, she clutched the blanket around her, feeling the warmth of the fire and the presence of someone who had chosen to care for her when she had nothing left. Silas kept the fire burning, his thoughts heavy with memories of loss but lightened by the simple act of helping a child who had no one else. Outside, the wind continued to howl, but inside the ranch was warm, safe, and alive with the quiet promise that perhaps tomorrow would be brighter. In those first days, Ayanna learned that survival was not just about escaping danger. It was also about finding moments of kindness in unexpected places. She had been cold, hungry, and alone, but now, in the small ranch with the cowboy who had opened his doors to her, she began to understand that even in a harsh world there could still be hope. The journey ahead would not be easy, but for the first time in a long while, she felt that maybe, just maybe, she could face it. Days passed on the ranch, and the cold wind outside continued to bite at the world. But inside, a fragile warmth had begun to grow between Silas and Ayanna. Every morning the girl woke to the smell of freshly baked bread, the warmth of the fire, and the quiet rhythm of ranch life. Silas had a routine, and he invited her to join it. At first she was shy and hesitant, unsure of her place in this new world. But little by little, she began to learn the small tasks that kept the ranch alive. Silas showed her how to feed the animals. Ayanna had never been close to farm animals before. The cows were large and lumbering, the chickens were quick and jittery, and the horses, well, they were magnificent creatures that both frightened and fascinated her. At first she kept her distance, watching Silas as he moved confidently among them. He handled the animals with calm strength, speaking softly, his hand steady and sure. Slowly he encouraged her to try. She reached out, trembling at first, to feed a chicken some corn. The bird pecked gently at her hand, and her face lit up with wonder. Silas smiled quietly, pleased not only that she was learning, but that she was beginning to trust the world again. The work on the ranch was never easy, especially in winter. The cold seeped into the bones, and the snow made even small tasks more difficult. Silas had expected a lonely season, but Ayanna's presence brought new energy, even if it was quiet and cautious. She learned to carry water from the well without spilling it, to stack firewood neatly, and to help Silas repair broken fences. Each task, no matter how small, became a lesson in survival, and with each passing day she grew stronger and more confident. At first, she spoke little. The weight of her past hung heavily on her, and she did not know how to share her story. Silas, patient as always, did not press her. He understood that trust could not be rushed, that a heart broken by loss needed time to heal. Instead, he spoke of simpler things: the weather, the animals, and sometimes the stars at night. Gradually, Ayana began to speak, her voice soft at first, sharing small fragments of her life, moments she had once thought insignificant. Silas listened with the same care he gave the animals, giving her the reassurance that her words were safe here. It was during one quiet evening, while the wind rattled the windows and the fire crackled in the hearth, that Ayana began to tell a piece of her story. She spoke of the home she had lost, of the family she had been separated from, and of the journey through the snow that had brought her to Silas's ranch. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, but she did not break down. Silas sat silently beside her, offering a quiet presence rather than words. Sometimes that was more powerful than anything spoken. By the time she finished, the room was heavy with emotion, but also with a sense of understanding. For the first time in many months, Ayana felt that someone truly knew her pain and still cared. Silas, too, began to open up in small ways. He shared stories of his own loss, of a family taken too soon, of friends who had moved on, of the lonely winters that had once seemed endless. He did not burden Ayana with grief, but he allowed her to see that he, too, understood suffering. In this exchange of quiet truths, a bond formed. It was not the loud, fiery bond of heroes or legends, but a subtle, steadfast connection built on trust, care, and shared experience. Despite the growing warmth inside the ranch, the world outside remained harsh. Some neighbors looked upon the girl with suspicion. Rumors traveled quickly in the small settlement scattered across the desert. Whispers about the dangers of helping a displaced Apache child reached the ears of Silas. People feared retaliation, they feared the unknown, and some thought that lending shelter to Ayana was reckless. Silas heard the murmurs, but he did not waver. He had always lived by his own code, and this code now demanded that he protect the girl who had arrived at his gate with nothing left. The tension from the outside world made the bond inside the ranch even more crucial. Ayana found comfort not only in the warmth of the fire, but in the quiet reassurance that Silas's protection was real. She began to help more actively with daily chores, no longer as a timid observer, but as an eager participant. She carried water, fed the animals, chopped firewood under Silas's watchful eye, and even learned to mend small holes in the fences. Each act, however simple, brought a sense of pride. She was no longer just a survivor. She was becoming part of a life she had once thought lost forever. Evenings became the most cherished time of day. The two would sit by the fire after the work was done, drinking warm tea and sometimes speaking quietly about the stars, the stories they carried, and the distant places they both had known. Silas had a small telescope by the window, and he would show Ayana how to look at the patterns of the night sky. She marveled at the constellations, their permanence in a world that had been anything but permanent for her. In these moments, the harshness of winter seemed less important, and the vast loneliness of the desert felt smaller and more bearable. One day, as the sun struggled through a thick layer of clouds, Silas took Ayana to the edge of the ranch. There, the snow stretched for miles, broken only by distant mesas and a few hardy trees. He taught her how to read the tracks left by animals in the snow, explaining which belonged to rabbits, coyotes, or deer. Ayana listened carefully, fascinated by the stories the land told. She realized that survival was not only about enduring hunger or cold, but also about understanding the world around her, learning its language, and respecting its rhythms. Silas watched her with quiet pride. But more importantly, she was finding confidence in herself. As the days turned into weeks, Ayana's body grew stronger, and her movements became more assured. The bruise marks and dirt that had clung to her when she first arrived faded, replaced by the clean, healthy look of someone who was being cared for. Yet despite the physical improvement, there remained a quiet sadness in her eyes, a reminder of the life she had lost and the loved ones she could not yet find. Silas never ignored it. He offered comfort when she needed it, a gentle hand on her shoulder, or a word of reassurance. Slowly, she began to smile more often, her laughter emerging as a rare, beautiful sound that filled the small house with warmth. One morning, Silas noticed that Ayana had gone out to check the animals without being asked. The snow was deep, and the wind was biting, yet she moved with determination. She fed the horses, spread hay for the cows, and even found a small, injured bird. Silas called out to her, concerned, but she waved him off. When it came closer, he saw that she had wrapped the bird in a small piece of cloth and was carefully tending to its wound. In that moment, Silas realized that Ayana had not only survived the world outside, but had also learned to care for life, even in the harshest conditions. He felt a surge of pride and relief. The bond between them deepened with each passing day, Ayana learned not only the skills of ranch life, but also the quiet strength of patience, resilience, and trust. She discovered that life could still be gentle, even after loss, and that there were people willing to help without expecting anything in return. Silas, in turn, found renewed purpose. He had lived alone for so long, guarding the ranch in his memories, that he had forgotten what it meant to hope. Ayana reminded him that kindness and courage could survive even in the coldest winters. Yet, despite the safety of the ranch, the outside world remained unpredictable. Storms could arrive without warning, and danger lurked in unexpected places. Silas knew that their peace was fragile, that survival required constant vigilance. But he also knew that Ayana was learning, that she was no longer entirely dependent on him, and that together they could face what came. Each challenge they met, whether a broken fence, a sick animal, or a sudden snowstorm, became a lesson in trust, endurance, and partnership. One evening, as the wind howled outside and snow drifted against the windows, Silas and Ayana sat by the fire. She had made small drawings in the dust on the table, sketches of animals and landscapes she had seen. Silas watched quietly, marveling at her creativity and her ability to find joy in small things. "You've come a long way," he said softly, and Ayana looked up at him with wide eyes. She had learned so much, but more than that, she had begun to believe in herself again. The nights on the ranch were long and quiet, yet they were filled with subtle moments of connection. The sound of the fire crackling, the low hum of the wind outside, the occasional laughter shared over a small mishap with the animals. These moments were small, but they were precious, and they marked the first real sense of home that Ayana had experienced in many months. She was learning not just to survive, but to live, to hope, and to dream again. And so, life on the ranch continued, a delicate balance of work, learning, and growing trust. The world outside remained cold, harsh, and uncertain, but inside, a small flame of hope burned steadily. Ayana and Silas had found each other in a time of need, and through patience, care, and quiet courage, they were slowly creating a space of safety, warmth, and new beginnings. Winter deepened across the desert, blanketing the ranch in thick snow and a bitter chill. Each morning, Ayana awoke to the pale light of a weak sun, brushing frost from the windows, and listening to the wind whip through the empty landscape. G had grown stronger in the weeks since arriving, but she still felt the cold deep in her bones. Silas had prepared her as best as he could, showing her how to layer clothes, how to keep hands and feet warm, and how to move carefully across the ice-crusted ground. Still, winter had its own dangers, and even the most careful could not escape its power. That morning, the wind carried a strange weight. It was heavier than usual, louder and more insistent, rattling the roof and shaking the thin walls of the house. Silas sensed it before he saw it, pausing at the window to watch the snow swirl into thick, blinding sheets. The storm had come unexpectedly, faster than any weather report could have predicted. Snowdrifts began forming against the fence, and the paths that Ayana had learned to walk were quickly covered, erased by the relentless fall. The wind howled, like a chorus of voices calling out across the frozen land. Silas turned to Ayana, whose wide eyes mirrored both awe and fear. "We need to stay inside," he said firmly, moving to block the door against the wind. The girl nodded silently, clutching her blanket closer to her. She had survived much already, but this storm felt different, wilder, untamed, and unrelenting. She could see the world outside through the frosted windows, but it was unrecognizable, a swirling wall of white. Every familiar feature of the ranch disappeared beneath the snow, leaving only uncertainty. As the storm raged, the challenges of survival became immediate and urgent. The fire needed constant tending, or the house would become dangerously cold. Silas and Ayana worked together to keep it alive, adding logs carefully, adjusting the dampers, and keeping the room as warm as possible. Their hands grew sore and red from the cold, and each step around the small house was measured. Even walking to the corner to check the animals became a trial. Silas looked at her, concern etched on his face, and reminded her not to go out unless absolutely necessary. Ayana nodded, though the desire to help and move always stirred within her. Despite the storm, they knew the animals still needed care. The chickens were huddled together for warmth, the horses stamped their hooves nervously, and the cows lowed softly in the snow-covered barn. Silas prepared to go outside to check on them, his boots crunching over the thickening drifts. Ayana insisted on coming, though he hesitated. "You need to stay inside," he warned. "It's too dangerous." But she shook her head, determination shining in her eyes. "I can do this." Silas finally relented, keeping her close as they stepped into the storm together. The snow bit through their clothing, and the wind pushed against them like a solid wall. Every step was a battle, and visibility was almost zero. Silas guided her hand in hand, moving cautiously toward the barn. Ayanna struggled to keep her balance, slipping and shivering, but she refused to complain. The animals needed them, and she could not ignore that. Her courage impressed Silas, though he kept his voice calm, guiding her without ever showing panic. Together they reached the barn, the wooden doors creaking under the pressure of the wind. Inside, the animals were cold and frightened, their eyes wide and breath misting in the frigid air. Silas and Ayanna worked quickly, spreading hay and ensuring each creature had access to food and water. Ayanna's hands were raw from the cold, but she pressed on, wrapping herself around the smaller animals, making sure they were warm and protected. She had never felt such exhaustion, yet she had never felt such purpose. Each creature that moved calmly under her care brought a small victory, a reminder that she could make a difference even in the harshest conditions. By midday, the storm showed no sign of letting up. The snowdrifts were already reaching the lower windows of the house, and the wind had begun to whistle through the cracks in the walls. Silas and Ayanna returned inside, soaked and cold, but satisfied that the animals were safe. They stripped off wet layers and huddled near the fire, letting the heat gradually restore warmth to their numb limbs. Silence fell between them, heavy with fatigue but also with relief. The storm was relentless, but for now they had survived it together. The quiet was short-lived. Ayanna noticed a sound outside the door, something different from the storm. At first she thought it was the wind, but then she heard it again, a faint, irregular crunch in the snow. She froze, listening. Silas noticed her expression and tensed, his instincts sharp and alert. "What is it?" she whispered. He shook his head. "Not sure," he replied cautiously. "Stay close. Don't move until we know." Together, they listened, hearts pounding, waiting for the next sound. The noise grew louder and closer. Silas motioned for Ayanna to stay back as he approached the door. Peering through a small crack in the wood, he could see footprints in the snow. Not animal tracks, but human. Someone, or something, was moving toward the ranch. He called softly to Ayanna to stay inside, then opened the door cautiously. A figure emerged through the storm. A man on horseback, struggling against the wind. His clothing was ragged, and his horse was thin and exhausted. The man called out, voice muffled by the storm, seeking help. Silas hesitated. Trusting strangers in such a storm was dangerous, but the man's desperation was clear. He looked as worn and vulnerable as Ayanna had when she first arrived. Silas nodded to him to move closer, then closed the door to protect against the worst of the wind. Ayanna watched silently, her own fear tempered by understanding. She knew what it was like to need help, and she felt a quiet sense of empathy for the stranger struggling against nature. Inside, the man explained, barely able to catch his breath. He had been traveling across the desert when the storm struck. His supplies were low, his horse weak, and he had nowhere to turn. Silas offered him food and a place by the fire, watching carefully as he ate. Ayanna noticed the relief in the man's eyes, the gratitude that shone through exhaustion and fear. She remembered her own first night at the ranch and felt a quiet sense of pride. She understood how much this small act of kindness meant. The storm raged on through the night, but inside the house, a fragile order returned. Silas and Ayanna worked together to keep the fire alive, to tend the animals, and to ensure that their unexpected guest was safe and fed. Ayanna began to see the strength in herself in new ways. She could help, she could endure, and she could remain calm even when fear threatened to overwhelm her. Silas watched her carefully, noting how much she had grown in courage and wisdom. She was no longer just a child who had arrived with nothing. She was becoming someone who could face the challenges of the world alongside him. The storm did not ease the next morning. Snow had piled high, and the wind continued to bite. Paths were buried, fences partially collapsed, and the barn doors threatened to buckle under the weight of the drifts. Silas knew that staying indoors would not be enough. The animals still needed care, and the ranch would suffer if ignored for long. He and Ayanna prepared to venture outside again, this time with extra supplies and a plan. Each step through the snow was a struggle. Every movement met with resistance from the cold, yet neither faltered. As they worked together, Ayanna noticed something remarkable. The skills Silas had taught her over the past weeks were no longer theoretical. They were alive in her. She moved with confidence, adjusted the water troughs, fed the animals efficiently, and even began to repair small sections of fence on her own. Silas watched, his heart swelling with pride. The girl who had arrived weak and fearful was now a capable, resilient presence, capable of facing storms both literal and metaphorical. By evening, they had made significant progress, but the storm showed no sign of slowing. Silas realized that supplies could run low, that another night might be even harsher, and that their safety depended on constant vigilance. He made a plan for rationing food, for conserving firewood, and for keeping the animals secure. Ayana listened carefully, her mind alert and focused. She understood that survival was not just about endurance. It was about preparation, observation, and quick thinking. Night fell again, and the storm reached its fiercest point. Snow piled against the windows, and the wind shrieked like a living thing. Silas and Ayana huddled near the fire, exhaustion pressing down on them, but neither gave in to fear. They had faced worse together, and the bond between them had strengthened through shared struggle. Ayana realized that the ranch, once simply a shelter, had become a symbol of resilience, a place where hope endured even in the harshest winter. In the quiet moments between gusts, Ayana spoke softly. She shared memories of her family, her home, and the journey she had made. Silas listened, offering the comfort of presence rather than words. In that exchange, a new understanding formed. Survival was not just physical, but emotional, and the strength of one's spirit could be nurtured through care, trust, and compassion. The storm finally began to wane in the early hours of morning. The snow had accumulated to great heights, the landscape transformed into a silent white wilderness. Silas and Ayana stepped outside carefully, assessing the damage. The ranch had survived, though barely. Fences would need repair, paths cleared, and animals tended. Yet despite the destruction, they felt an undeniable sense of triumph. Together, they had faced the storm and endured, stronger and more capable than before. Ayana looked at Silas, gratitude shining in her eyes. "We did it," she whispered. He nodded, his face set in quiet determination. "Yes," he replied. "We faced it together." And in that moment both understood the truth. The harsh world outside could not break the spirit of those who cared for each other. Even in the coldest, most unforgiving winters, hope and courage could survive. The morning after the storm brought a quiet calm to the ranch. The sun rose weak and pale, reflecting off the thick blankets of snow and casting a soft glow over the landscape. Every fence, tree, and rooftop was dusted and white, and the wind had softened to a gentle whisper. Silas stepped outside first, boots crunching in the snow, surveying the ranch. The damage was not minor. Fences had buckled under the weight of the snow, the barn door had shifted on its hinges, and some of the smaller paths they had cleared were buried again. Yet the ranch stood. Life had survived the storm, and with it, hope remained alive. Ayana followed, her cheeks pink from the cold, her eyes wide as she took in the frozen landscape. She had never seen the world so still, so quiet, and so untouched by human presence. For a moment, the hardships of the past weeks felt distant, replaced by a sense of awe. Silas noticed the small smile on her face and felt a warmth in his chest. She had endured so much, yet she was still able to marvel at the world. He realized that her spirit, though tested, had remained unbroken. The day began with repair work. Silas and Ayana set to clearing paths first, shoveling snow to make movement easier and safer. Their hands grew red and stiff from the cold, but neither complained. The air was crisp, and each breath carried a sense of renewal. Silas had brought extra tools inside before the storm, and together they worked efficiently to mend fences that had collapsed. Ayana lifted the wooden beams with surprising strength, guided by Silas's careful instructions. Every task completed was a small victory, and each moment of progress lifted their spirits. The animals were next. Silas and Ayana checked the barns and the feeding troughs, making sure no creature had suffered more than necessary. A few of the chickens were missing, likely hidden under deep snowdrifts, but most were safe. The horses had weathered the storm well, though they were restless from the long confinement. Ayana moved among them gently, her hands skilled in calming them, her voice soft but firm. Silas watched, amazed at how far she had come. The girl who had arrived at his gate, shivering and silent, was now strong, confident, and capable of taking care of life around her. The day moved slowly, hours slipping by in quiet labor and the occasional laughter when a fence leaned too much or an animal acted stubborn. Silas realized that the routine they had built over the past weeks had become a rhythm that brought stability. Ayana was no longer just a guest, she was part of the ranch. She carried herself with a quiet authority, knowing when to ask for help and when to take action. She had learned more than survival. She had learned to live with purpose. As evening approached, the clouds began to part, revealing patches of the winter sky. The sun's weak rays reflected off the snow, casting a soft light across the ranch. Silas and Ayana sat near the fire inside the house, warming their hands and sharing a simple meal of stew and bread. Ayana spoke about her dreams, the ones she had kept secret for months. She wanted to see the mountains, to travel beyond the desert, and to help others like her in the future. Silas listened quietly, feeling a swell of pride and hope. Her dreams were fragile, yes, but they were alive, and that was more than enough. That night, as snow settled outside and the wind whispered softly against the windows, Silas shared stories of the past winters he had endured alone. He told her about the nights when the cold had seemed impossible, about the loneliness that had crept in, and about the few times he had felt despair. Ayanna listened intently, understanding not just the hardships, but the resilience it took to continue despite them. She realized that courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to keep moving forward even when fear was present. Over the following days, the world around the ranch began to awaken again. The snow, though still deep, started to soften under the sun's pale warmth. Silas and Ayanna continued repairing fences and clearing paths, but the work was lighter now, easier. They began to notice small signs of life returning. Birds chirping in distant trees, rabbits emerging from hidden burrows, and the soft crunch of fresh animal tracks in the snow. The ranch, once threatened by the storm, was now alive with movement and energy. The community around the ranch began to take notice as well. Word of the storm's impact spread, and neighbors slowly came to offer help or simply to check on their safety. Some were hesitant at first, unsure about Ayanna's presence, but seeing the bond between her and Silas and witnessing her skill and courage, their suspicions began to fade. People who had doubted the girl's place on the ranch began to recognize her resilience and the quiet determination that had carried her through the storm. Slowly, she became part of the larger community, a symbol of endurance and hope. Ayanna's own confidence grew each day. She learned not only to manage the ranch's immediate needs, but also to anticipate challenges. She could read the weather, recognize signs of fatigue in the animals, and handle small emergencies on her own. Silas, ever patient, allowed her to take responsibility where appropriate, trusting her judgment and celebrating her successes. For Ayanna, this trust was more than guidance. It was proof that she had value, that she mattered, and that her actions could have real impact. One afternoon, Silas and Ayanna stood on a ridge overlooking the ranch, taking a rare moment to pause. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the snow. Silas pointed out the distant mountains, their peaks capped with snow, and encouraged Ayanna to dream beyond the boundaries of the ranch. She gazed at them, imagining the journey she might take one day, the people she might help, and the life she could build. For the first time since losing everything, she felt a sense of possibility. She was no longer defined by what she had lost, but by what she could achieve. That evening, they sat by the fire, the warmth of the flames reflecting in their eyes. Ayanna began to speak more openly about her past, sharing memories of her family, her home, and the friends she had lost. Silas listened quietly, offering comfort and understanding without judgment. Did not promise to replace her family, for he knew that was impossible, but he offered something equally important, a place where she belonged, a life that could continue despite loss, and the assurance that she would never be alone again. Days turned into weeks, and the seasons began to shift. The harshest winter winds slowly gave way to milder temperatures, the snow melting to reveal the desert beneath. Silas and Ayanna continued their work, but now there was time for reflection, for storytelling. The ranch had survived not just the storm, but also the loneliness and uncertainty that had once defined it. It had become a place of stability, hope, and connection, a home where life could flourish once more. Ayanna began taking on responsibilities that went beyond survival. She helped Silas plan the garden for spring, organize supplies, and even began teaching herself basic herbal remedies for the animals. Each new skill strengthened her sense of independence, and she realized that she was capable of more than she had ever imagined. Silas watched with quiet pride, knowing that the girl who had arrived shivering and alone was now confident, capable, and wise beyond her years. The ranch became a place where community and compassion met resilience and courage. Neighbors began to visit more frequently, offering help and sharing news. Children from nearby homes would sometimes come to watch Ayanna and the animals, fascinated by her bravery and skill. She welcomed them, teaching small lessons she had learned, showing them how to care for the animals and respect the land. In these moments, she realized that she was not just surviving. She was inspiring, giving hope to others in the same way that Silas had given it to her. One evening, as the sun set behind the distant mesas, painting the sky in gold and pink, Ayanna stood by the fence watching the animals settle for the night. Silas joined her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You've come a long way," he said softly. "More than you know." She turned to him, a small smile on her lips, and nodded. "I've learned from you," she replied. "And I've learned from myself." There was a quiet understanding between them, a recognition of the journey they had both endured and the bond they had formed. In the months that followed, life on the ranch became steady and predictable, though never without its challenges. The harsh lessons of winter remained fresh in their minds, but they were tempered by the strength they had found in each other. Silas and Ayanna continued to grow together, supporting each other through the small struggles of daily life, and celebrating each other through the small struggles of daily life, and celebrating each other through the small struggles. The ranch, once simply a shelter, had become a home filled with warmth, trust, and hope. Ayanna's journey had been long and difficult, filled with loss, fear, and uncertainty. Yet, through it all, she had discovered courage, resilience, and the power of compassion. Silas, too, had found something he had thought lost forever, the ability to care deeply, to trust, and to hope again. Together they had faced the harshness of the world and emerged stronger, their bond unshakable, their spirits renewed. The story of the ranch, the storm, and the girl who had arrived with nothing spread quietly through the surrounding community. It was not a tale of heroics or grandeur, but a story of perseverance, kindness, and the quiet strength of human connection. Ayanna had survived because someone had chosen to care, and Silas had rediscovered hope because someone had trusted him to do so. Their lives were forever changed, not by wealth or power, but by the small, consistent acts of courage, compassion, and love. And so, as the desert thawed under the early spring sun, the ranch stood as a testament to endurance. The animals thrived, the land healed, and two lives intertwined in ways neither had expected. Ayanna had found a place to belong, a place to grow, and a place to hope again. Silas had found a companion, a renewed purpose, and a reminder that even in a harsh world, kindness could flourish. Together they faced the future with courage, knowing that no storm, no matter how fierce, could ever break the bond they had forged.